Welcome to the Creative Industry Insight podcast, a podcast that looks at various roles in the creative world. I'm your host, Bobby. Today's guest, graphic designer Josh Douglas-Bagley, joins us to talk about their work on the gold. Please be warned there are heavy spoilers in this episode, so sit back and relax as we jump into the conversation with Josh. Hi Josh, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on.
I'm really excited to talk about your work on the gold. I think it could be one of the top 10 shows of the year so far. I know we're only at the end of May, but I think it was one of those where once you press play, you couldn't stop watching it.
Yeah, it kind of drew people in. Lots of people remember it and lots of people had no idea about it. So it's, kind of coming at it from both angles. Yeah.
I know, it's one of those weird bits in history where it's funny how many people don't know about it unless you're of a certain age. I know in my mind you'd probably still think about like the Great Train Robbery or even recently like Hatton Garden Job, but this one, so much money was stolen, yet I had no idea about it.
No, nor did I before I started. I didn't know about it. I mentioned it to my parents and they're like, oh yeah, that. So, well, yeah, just passed me by. I guess the establishment don't like to talk about it. It's a bit of an embarrassment.
Yeah, exactly. And especially if you say, I don't know if you read the book that it was based on, it's like how much more, I think the TV show kind of glossed over the embarrassment a little bit with what else people were doing and how they were getting away with it. But that's neither here or there. You were the graphics designer on the show, but before we jump in, what is the role of a graphics designer on a TV show?
So, graphic designer on the TV show is primarily to facilitate the vision of the designer or the director in any kind of paper or signage or screens, anything that has text or imagery that isn't a prop usually falls under the role of the graphic designer. So anything from like a key hero leaflet prop to a huge billboard to mobile phone screens on modern stuff to, anything really.
And then on something like this, I'm slightly jumping ahead, but I guess something like this, because it's based on true events, do you have to sort of split your work between like historical accuracy, so with newspapers, posters, and I guess billboards to other signage, or do you get a bit more creative licensing with it, or do you want to do like exact copies of like designs?
I tend to like to recreate things as close as to what they would have been, just so when people are watching, they kind of get that nostalgia for the era. There is freedom in certain aspects. You know, you're not tied to exactly what it was, but to get the kind of the tone of it right and the feel of what things look like is something I strive to do. Yeah.
I guess if they have like a newspaper clipping from like the Daily Mail or the Sun or whatever from that time, do you usually just go through sort of archives to see what it looked like during that time and then copy the typography and the images that are there? Well, probably replace the images that are used because you've got actors playing those characters.
Yeah. So first stop will be the newspaper archives, and we'll kind of pull newspapers and stories that there were at that time. But then sometimes it's not as visually engaging or easily readable as we need it to be on screen. So I'll kind of use that as a framework and then make it a bit more legible, because sometimes you only have, a few seconds to read what's on screen. So yeah, we'll try and make it as historically accurate using all the right typefaces and the type of images that were used. And for this one, we licensed the mastheads of the actual papers of the time. So the newspapers had to sign off on the work that we did to make sure that they were happy with it. But I'll try and make it as realistic looking as possible, because it's always a bit of a bugbear when you're watching something and the newspaper doesn't immediately grab you as looking like a newspaper. It looks more like a prop, and it kind of throws me a bit. So I try and make it look as real as possible.
There are certain shows where they have newspapers. I think the first one that comes to mind is something like Succession, where they had, I think it was like in episode 9 when they showed the sort of play-by-play of sort of like election night. And I think the tweet that I saw was that massive shout out to the art department for putting so much effort into something that's been shown for like 5 seconds on screen.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that. You could spend weeks doing something that's only on screen for half a second, but I don't think you'd do the job if you wanted everything you did to be on screen all the time. You'd quickly lose hope and not want to do it, I don't think.
I guess as well, it's like even though you know it's going to be on screen for just a split second or even maybe a few minutes, I guess you still want your work to be like the best as possibly can be, even if it's a split second. Because we always know somebody online's going to clip something and will be like, it will become like viral or something.
Exactly. That's the thing of nightmares, you know. If someone pulls you off on your work and it goes on the internet, and I don't think you'd ever live that. Well, it's not in the world, but just try and make it not happen. Just try and make viewing as immersive and easy for the viewer as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And not take them out of the show. Just to sort of track back a little bit, how did the project come about for you, and what is it that made you want to take it on?
So I saw an advertisement for the role on the Graphics Union. Shout out to the Graphics Union. Do you know much about it?
So I didn't realise there was a graphics union.
Yeah, it's great. It's it's a union of graphic designers working film and TV, and it's kind of like a little community where people can ask questions and share supplier information and get jobs. So people who don't have a graphic designer when starting production can put an advert for their job up there, and then people apply, and then they can go through and choose who they want. So that's how I saw it. I saw the name Brinksmat, and I didn't know anything about it, so I kind of did a bit of research. And I'd always wanted to work on something set in the 80s because visually it's just quite an exciting thing in the graphics world. And I applied, and they got back to me, and I joined. I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks later.
Sounds like it's a really easy process when you break it down like that.
Yeah,
but I guess there's a lot of sort of showing off of sort of portfolio and actually understanding what, as you said, it's going to be in the 80s, so it's a period piece, which in itself is a weird thing to say because it doesn't feel like 80s was a period that was so not that long ago. But it's one of those things, I guess you had to get a portfolio together and maybe generate ideas of what is going to look like in that sort of time period.
Yeah, so I put together a portfolio of my work up until that point, trying to pick out all the best bits that I felt would showcase my talents. I didn't have anything from the 80s, so I'd done stuff in the 60s, 50s, a little bit of 70s. And so you try and put your best representation of your work forward and hope that they like it. I've been doing it for kind of a while now, so I had a good bits to choose from. Yeah, luckily they said yes and invited me for an interview, and the rest was history.
It's still exciting though to hear about when you gather all your work together, especially I guess having various decades to reference from kind of shows like your versatility and knowing what each sort of time period would look like, and sort of having that up your sleeve to say, look, I could do this, I could do that. I guess the natural progression now is to go to the 80s and see what I can flex on the screen.
Yeah, it's always nice to dive into something new. I mean, some people just stick with a period that they're comfortable in, and that's great, and they do great stuff. But I always like to try and challenge myself and keep it exciting. That's part of the reason why I do this job, is because every production is different, and it's always a chance to dive into something new.
I think you always want your next job to be a challenge, even though it's like probably riding a bike, but just with different variations, right? And new tricks that you can learn, and working with different people, like understanding what they'll need and what they'll need you to create as well.
Yeah, I mean, every director, every production designer, they're all different. They all have different ways of bringing what would be the same story to screen. You could read a script, and one director wants to go a completely different direction with it. So it's always interesting, kind of feeling out people's interpretation of what the work is on paper. Yeah, it's exciting to try and make what's in their heads a reality on screen.
When you have like discussions with production designer and directors, because they obviously have they have a vision of what they would like, and I think sometimes it's very hard to sort of transfer the image that you have in your head to sort of words in terms of like explaining what you want. And sometimes somebody might draw it out on a piece of paper and their drawing skills aren't very good. Like mine, for example, and they sort of have to show you that like a stick figure drawing of what they want. And you have to take that as an interpretation of like, can you do this, but 1,000 times better? But with these sort of conversations and discussions, like how do you guys go about communicating ideas and for you to sort of take what's been asked by someone and then to sort of translate it into something that's going to be put on screen?
So my first stop would be to create a mood board or some sort of visual board of some of the key graphic props included in the script. And so these might be pictures from reference books of photography of the time, or bits of ephemera that I've found online or in person. And I'll just kind of put it all on boards, not with any clear direction of it's going to be that, but just to give them something to go, oh, it's not that, it's more like that, or it's somewhere in between the two. And then it kind of just gives you a bit of a jump off point to start making initial ideas and designs that you can then, if you're lucky enough to have the time with the director, to go into a show and tell and kind of give them the first look at what you are going to provide. And then they can then carry on with notes and say, yeah, this is great, or I kind of want it like this. And it just makes the process a bit easier than going, what's this like? And then, like you said, they may not have the visual language to tell you exactly what it is. So at least they can see something and reference that, and it just makes it a bit smoother. Because you don't often have a lot of time with directors, so you kind of have to get as much information downloaded from them as you can. So it just makes it a bit easier.
I guess what I quite like from the answer is hearing about like the creating the mood boards and going into the sort of research stage of it. Because I can imagine during those sort of times is probably the most exciting because there's I guess we have so much accessibility with like the internet and various books now where you can literally just find so many different things of the different times of the 80s periods.
Yeah, it's the internet is a massive help. I don't really know what I would do without the internet in this job, because it's just like your first port of call for everything, pretty much. Like if you have a book on it, great. If you have the chance to see some of the ephemera of the time in person, even better. But Google is definitely a big help. Yeah, it's kind of we were quite lucky on this one. We had a dedicated researcher for about 6 weeks of prep, I believe, maybe a bit longer. And so she went through the whole script, and she went through all the old documentaries on Brinksmat that were on YouTube and other, BFI, BBC, all that stuff. And she would take screen grabs of all of the locations that they used, like the actual locations where all these stuff took place, all the news footage that there was at the time. So when it came to recreating things like police vehicles, emblems and things like that, it was all there to kind of draw from. I mean, I like doing my own research, but it was a massive help having that kind of base to start from.
That must have been a pretty cool job, just being a researcher, sort of like basically looking at stuff with a fine tooth comb and how sort of things looked at the time, because it is a certain time period, but then it also jumps from various sort of locations in terms of you're based in London, you're based in Kent at some point. You also go to different countries. Where, as a graphic designer, how difficult does that become for designing? Because even though they might not be on location filming in these areas, you still need to create stuff that makes people be like, oh, okay, we're in Kent, for example, with that sort of visual language, or we're in Spain because of that billboard for a beer, for example.
So I live in Orpington in Kent. So a lot of the locations in the story are around where I live. So I'd go on, I'd go on a drive and I'd have a look at signage that was still hanging around from the time. And yeah, it was a big help kind of looking at old archive footage. Like there's video enthusiasts who have like the 80s in a certain village in Kent on their village videography website. So I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So yeah, it definitely helped having an idea of the local area, because I kind of knew where I might find certain footage and research materials. But yeah, with regards to Spain, I mean, same again. I mean, you're looking at old footage, news footage, and then you're kind of just drawing on your own experience of what stuff's like abroad. So yeah, it's hard to explain. I don't know. It's like yeah, I guess it's the same. You have stuff that is universal, but then you have stuff that's specific to a country. And we had an art director who's was looking after the Spanish shoot, so he'd feed us some sort of references from Spain if he was there and he found something. But mostly it's just finding references like you would at home, but making sure that they're true to the country where they originally came from.
I guess it makes it sort of difficult when you do have those other countries and the feel of it, just because I guess if we're looking at like a certain point in history, or because we're specifically looking at a event. So for like example, Brinks Mats, you like as like a graphic designer or even researcher, you're looking at Heathrow, what the police sort of the flying squad, what their sort of feel would be like, and then on top of that, like the whole Kent area. I think in a way, having those additional countries as well, probably I don't know. Maybe it's just like the research has changed, or like the areas have changed. That it's kind of difficult that you don't have as many sort of like village enthusiasts as you said who might have recorded things at that time. So some of it might be just lost to time or hidden away somewhere in the archive.
Yeah, and I mean, especially with different language, it's hard to search for Spanish references where you're putting English into a search engine, you're not getting anything back, or you're getting the wrong things completely. So you kind of just have to run with it and maybe use color as a way to identify different places and use different palettes. But yeah, it's a bit trickier when it comes to creating things that are supposed to be abroad and you don't have the reference material there. So yeah, it comes with its own challenges.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think trying to make it look 80s esque as well with the design and what's being built up in the area at the time as well. For example, like with John Palmer and his like scheme with the homes, sort of coming up with those big posters of selling a dream to people.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, there was a few timeshare scheme posters that I found, but then you also there's all the package holiday leaflets and brochures of the time, so you kind of get the idea of the way that they were promoting these sort of things. You kind of use those, and then use a bit of creative license, I guess, to make it what would John Palmer do, and how would he promote his timeshare. And so yeah, you fall back on fonts and colours and the type of photography that people were using, the tone of the images, and yeah, you kind of end up with something that feels right rather than being a direct copy of something.
I guess it also makes it you can add your own spin to it at the same time, and maybe hide a little Easter egg for like your friends to be like a little sort of in joke that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think my wife has been on nearly in some sort of graphic on every job that I've done. She's like, "Oh, you haven't used that picture again, have you?" I was like, "Yeah, sorry." So yeah, I like to sneak family and friends in there when I can, and I'm the author of a lot of newspaper articles. It's just if you're going to see my name, if you're looking that closely, you should know who wrote it.
See, and there's also like you can tell your wife that. See, I do love you. I'll make sure that I put you in my work and always on my mind.
Exactly. Yeah. Not a moment passes, love, and I'm not thinking of you. So there you go.
You brought up another point as well with the researcher when they were sort of looking at things, and you mentioned about police emblems and action vehicles. Are you responsible for creating the police emblems for the action vehicles? And would that be the same for when it comes to costumes as well?
Yeah. So we didn't have clearance to use the Metropolitan Police. They're very expensive, and they have a lot of terms as to how they're represented. So yeah, so I made emblems for all of the different police forces that would be shown. So Ken, Metropolitan, Spanish police force, and then yeah, you kind of primarily work with costume, and you help them with the design so that they can get badges made up and they can get costumes embroidered. But then yeah, it goes as far as action vehicles as well when they've got big emblems on the side. So I'll be responsible for turning vehicles of the time weren't necessarily police vehicles into vehicles that look like they were driven by the police. So do vinyl wraps on the sides and get the emblems on, and yeah, all fun and games.
Does that come with its own sort of issues in terms of designing because you're getting like emblems on shrink wraps, and also if you're creating stuff for costume department, the various materials that are used, do you have to think about how like the format of your emblem's going to be? Because if it's on a shrink wrap where it's quite big, you don't want it to come out printed and just look fuzzy.
Yeah, so I'll do a couple of different versions. So, for example, if they're having badges cast in metal, I'll probably do a simpler version so that the detail isn't lost in when they're manufacturing those. But then, like you say, when I'm doing vehicles and the emblem's like nearly a foot wide, you want to add a bit more detail in there, and you kind of have the right colours that they would use. And yeah, there's different variations for different applications, but you kind of want to have it all unified and not feel like they're separate things and just the same shape. So yeah, it's not too tricky. It's something that is quite fun to do. Yeah, you got to take into consideration the different ways that these things are going to be made and seen.
Yeah, because if you're mentioning about how if something like the say badge when they're getting that molded, I'm always just picturing it as like another layer, for example. So if you have the bigger that you get the whatever's getting printed or blown up, like another layer of details that you add to it, or
Yeah,
a little sort of saying on it, like to serve and protect, for example. But then on a sort of like casting, you just make it not as plain as possible, but like as you said, as little details, so it doesn't look all sort of blotchy and sort of like false looking, basically.
yeah, you don't want it to look like something that someone bought in a fancy dress shop where there's bits of moulding everywhere and it's not as clean. These things would have been made with quite a bit of detail, but kind of
I think that's always that level of detail that you need to sort of keep an eye out for. As those enthusiasts will see, well, that badge is not correct. It's actually a 1997 badge.
yeah.
Yeah,
I think there was some of that with the cars. And that car came out 2 years after this would have been. So yeah, there's always an enthusiast for something, and you do what you can do, but sometimes you can only get a certain vehicle, and you just have to make the best of it. So
yeah, exactly. And I think as well, sometimes it's a TV show. You have a more of a suspension of disbelief with vehicles, but I think if as you said, if that's the only thing that you can get, I think the best thing is just to dress it as well as possible for the time as well.
yeah, exactly.
There's another point that you made earlier about this is the newspaper clippings and getting the licensing for the masterhead, and you touched a little bit on licensing with the Met, with how difficult it is. What's the process of like getting these newspapers on board to basically use their images? Because as you mentioned with the Met, it's very difficult and they're very specific about how they want to be portrayed. What's it like getting newspapers on board?
So it wasn't too bad with the newspapers. Clearance can be an issue for a variety of different things, and it depends on the production company that you're working with. So, like for instance, Netflix at the moment have like an indemnity clause or indemnity policy that they're not worried about the use of brands, so you can use whatever you'd like, and they feel like it's not the brand doing anything wrong, it's the character, so that do what it would be in real life, and there shouldn't be a problem. But with other productions, like for instance, as was BBC, there are quite established rules and regulations that you have to adhere to. So you can't like promote smoking or use brands that are in existence today that would be promoting something that isn't good. So, but going back to newspapers, what we would do is we'd do a mock-up of what we wanted to portray, and then we would go through production, and they would liaise with the, I don't know what they are, like the copyright holders or the legal side to the publishing of the newspaper, and then they would say, okay, yeah, that's fine, or you need to change this font to be more in line with what it would be, or things like that. And then you'd get sign off, and then you print and send it. So it wasn't too painful for newspapers on this one. But sometimes they're like, no, we don't want anything to do with it. Completely make up something new, and then you just have to make something look realistic that isn't. And that's where the skill comes in, I guess.
It's always quite fascinating to hear what companies will and will not allow in sort of like TV shows. I think, what is it, Apple have a rule where it's like the bad guy can't use an iPhone. So then it's just like, well, but then that gives it away a little bit, because if they have an Android and then everybody has an iPhone, something's up.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, what phone's he using? Oh no, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. I think they are relaxing that a little bit. I think if you want to have an Apple product placement or prop placement, as we now call it, then you need to stick to their rules a lot. But if you just buy the phone, I think you kind of skirt around that issue a little bit, and you can have a bit more freedom. So you can kind of throw the audience the wrong way with your villain using an iPhone. Turns out that they are the bad guy.
Or a plot twist. Were there any challenges with other companies when it came to getting licenses, or was there any times that you used companies that you found out had sort of folded, so it'd actually make it more difficult to get their licensing?
Yeah, you do find that some companies aren't in existence anymore, and there's no kind of contact information or paper trail for production. I necessarily won't do all the legwork of trying to contact these people. There'll be like a dedicated clearance person within the production team. So you do sometimes hit dead ends. I remember on the Gold, we were trying to use, there was a reference to a very specific house that they'd acquired through this property scheme that they had. And they wanted to use the image of the real house. And the only image we could find was from an estate agent's website, I believe. And they didn't know who owned the image. They couldn't get in contact with the photographer because they didn't know who that was. So we just had to abandon that in the end and go down a different route. But you do often come up against these dead ends, and you just have to adapt and try and find the next best solution. But I mean, 8 times out of 10, it usually goes the way that you want. And then you've got the fee aspect to it. So it depends how much money the company want to spend, but it's usually pretty accessible to get what you want.
Yeah, and just the idea of like the dead end bit, it's like, imagine having your heart set on something and then you can't find out who's owns a photo, who can license it, and I guess you don't want to take the risk of being sued over a photo that somebody would point out that is theirs. But I still think the idea of like the legwork that somebody has to do just to get this sort of image onto screen, and I guess like as audience members, this is the sort of stuff you don't really consider or think about when people are making TV shows.
Yeah, there's a whole hidden world. I mean, it's probably the reason why we all love jobs. I mean, there's so much behind the scenes things that go into the making of a show, even before you get to filming it. I mean, that comes with its own challenges, but just getting the sets ready and getting everything as realistic as possible, especially for a project like this. There's a lot of work that goes into making sure that legally everyone's covered and everyone gets visually what they want. Yeah, it's a whole thing.
Hats off to the people who put that effort in to make sure that your hard work is seen on screen.
Yeah, totally. Big up the clearance people. Yeah. Very important job.
you already mentioned about the historical accuracy, but also like the story of Brinksmat does span over a certain amount of time, and it's not very much. It's not really well known in the show what year it is after the crime has taken place, when things are jumping to and from the UK and Spain, and how the investigation's going along. Did that matter in your graphic design, or were you just told the sort of broad sense of going through a time period and just sticking to that?
We have a script supervisor who will do a story day breakdown of the script, and they'll go through it with the director, and they'll kind of allocate dates. I mean, with this, it was kind of important because there were certain historical dates when certain things happened. Yeah, so they would go through the script and allocate dates and kind of plot out the timeline of the show, which is helpful for us because then we can get newspaper dates right. Not that everyone's going to see them, but it's just to kind of get the timeline of things right. And so script supervisor will do that. And then I think the show went from, I think it was early or late 1983 up until 1987, roughly at the end. I might be wrong, but that was the kind of the 4 years that we were working with. Most of it was about a year after the robbery, and then there was a couple of jumps towards the end. It's not something that flashes up on the screen, the year is this. So it's not hugely important, but just for our sanity, really, like knowing what came when, and if there are any slight visual changes in graphics over that period, things start leaning towards the 90s, and you can have a slight change with what you're doing. So yeah, it's helpful, but not necessarily something that you need to stick to 100%.
Okay, because I was sort of curious to know if there was certain things popping up in certain episodes just because of the time period. But I guess having that little bit more creative freedom and not sticking to, as you're saying, that this is the year 1985, and having stuff pop up to make it look obvious that it's that time period, it was more just a sort of rough estimate.
Yeah, I mean, we did try to kind of keep it, not that it's going to pull you out, but there is only so much you can do. I mean, like, people notice with the vehicles and things, but you come up against things where it is what it is. We're not making a museum archive exhibition, we're making a TV show, so kind of have to go with it. And there's always a bit of blurring between years, not everything changes every year. There's always a bit of hangover from years before. So yeah, it wasn't something that we were too concerned about, but just to keep in mind that time is shifting a little bit, and to just keep an eye on that.
You kind of make it a little bit more fun for researching to know what's the sort of sprinkle in for the year that they're going for, and maybe adding specifics as well.
Yeah, exactly. If you see something that is a year too early or too late, but it's super visually nice to look at, and it's like a nice graphic that you'd like to try and make, then I think if it's visually nice to look at, you're going to want to put it in.
Well, it kind of makes me want to watch it again just to see if I can point stuff out, and then maybe watch it with someone who's a little bit older than me to say, well, hang on, that's not right.
Send me a long list of inaccuracies, and I'll go through them.
With pleasure. Just to wrap this episode up, what was your favourite graphic to design? Was it the posters, or was it the police symbol?
Yeah, I like doing the bigger bits when you know that it's going to be seen on screen. But I think some of the most, I don't know if it's the most rewarding thing, but one of the things that I enjoyed was doing all of the property documents. So when Cooper's having his meetings with all the gangsters, telling him which investments they're making, I couldn't really find anything online to show what these documents would look like. And so my father-in-law used to be an estate agent, not so much then, but a bit later. But his brother's still got a company, and they managed to dig out some of the old property documents and listings. He sent them over so I could get them exactly as they were. And that was a nice little touch. I felt like, mission completed there. I made it. No one's going to jump out and go, oh, it wasn't like that. So yeah, that was quite a rewarding one to do. You probably never saw them because they were only on screen for like 5 minutes and they were in folders and things, but I know that they were right, so it's fine.
I guess that, but then, as you said, like having that's like your father-in-law's brothers having those documents, I'm quite surprised he still has those sort of hidden
I
away
was
somewhere after sort of what is it, 30 years? No,
well,
it's
nearly like
40, 40 years. Yeah, blimey, my maths is terrible. That he still has them sort of just stored away somewhere.
Yeah, he put in a call and then came back a week later with a stack of documents. I was like, oh, wow, good work.
That's pretty cool. And see, and then so like, if anyone's listening, it's important to keep your stuff, okay? Because they'll come in handy one day.
Definitely. Be a hoarder, but be organised.
Exactly. Label it up. That's the important thing, so that people would know what's what. Josh, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's been a pleasure.
Gold is streaming now on BBC iPlayer. You can catch all the episodes there. I would highly encourage people to go watch it because it is probably one of the best shows of the year. Definitely in my top 10. And I don't say that lightly, by the way. I don't say that to everyone, so don't think I'm lying about that.
Nah, I believe you. It was good.
Thank you again. You take care and bye-bye.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.